Listen carefully. Most men think they understand women. They really believe they've figured out the code, the little tricks that make her laugh, the right compliments, the perfect timing for a text. But here's the truth. You don't understand women. Not even close. You understand patterns you've seen online. You understand advice from guys who act confident but are just guessing. You understand your own logic, and that's exactly why you keep getting it wrong. Because female psychology doesn't run on logic, it runs on emotion. You've been taught your whole life that if you act nice, stay honest, show effort, things will work out. That's not how it works with attraction. That's how it works in business, in school, in every logical part of your life. But attraction, that's chaos disguised as chemistry. Here's what most men never learn. Women don't fall for the guy who does everything right. They fall for the guy who makes them feel something. And that something isn't always comfortable. It's not safety or politeness. It's tension. It's mystery. It's unpredictability. It's the emotional high and the uncertainty that makes her heartbeat quicken. When you text her too often, chase her too fast, show her that she's your whole world, you kill that spark. You take away the one thing that makes her brain light up like a storm, the unknown. You think you're showing love. She feels you're showing need, and nothing kills attraction faster than neediness disguised as devotion. Women are emotional creatures, yes, but not in the way most men think. They don't want constant reassurance. They don't want a man who bends his life around theirs. They want to feel something real. Sometimes that means feeling challenged. Sometimes it means being slightly uncertain about where they stand, because that's when emotions come alive. Here's what you must understand. When a woman pulls away, when she gets distant, when her texts turn cold, she's not always losing interest. She's checking the weather. She's seeing if your energy changes when she withdraws. She's testing if you'll panic, chase, beg, or crumble. And if you do, game over. Not because she's cruel, not because she wants power, but because her instincts tell her something deeper. If he loses control this easily, how will he handle me? Men chase logic. Women chase emotion. That's why so many men stay confused, because they're trying to reason with something that was never logical in the first place. So if you want to understand women, stop looking for formulas. Stop memorizing dating hacks, and stop analyzing emojis. Start paying attention to energy, to tone, to the feeling between words. That's where the truth lives. That's where attraction begins. That's where understanding her truly starts. Section 2. The emotional engine. If you really want to understand women, stop listening to what they say and start watching what they do. Because what a woman says she wants and what she actually responds to are often two different worlds. She might say she wants a nice guy, someone caring and consistent, but then she falls for the guy who makes her heart race and her thoughts spin out of control. You think she's lying. She's not. She's feeling. That's the emotional engine that drives every decision she makes, from who she dates to who she ignores. See, attraction for women doesn't start in the eyes. It starts in the nervous system. It's that subtle tension she feels when you're around. That mix of curiosity, safety and danger that she can't explain. And here's where most men go wrong. They try to talk her into attraction. They try to prove they're worthy through logic, but you can't convince a woman to feel. You can only trigger it. Think of female attraction like music. You can't explain why a certain song hits you in the chest, it just does. Her emotions work the same way. It's rhythm, it's timing, it's energy. You can't outthink that. You can only tune into it. When she meets a man, she's not analyzing him logically. She's scanning for emotional signals. Does he seem grounded or desperate, confident or performative? Does he feel like a man who can handle her storms or one who will drown in them? That's what makes her decide in seconds whether you're attractive or forgettable. Most men confuse emotional connection with emotional dependency. They think if they share every feeling, she'll feel closer. Wrong. She wants to feel you understand emotions, not that you depend on hers. Here's the thing. A woman's emotions change fast. She can be warm one day, distant the next. You'll think she's playing games, but she's not. She's feeling life in real time. Her hormones, her environment, her mood, they all shift the landscape of her emotions. That's why being emotionally stable is so magnetic. When her emotions crash like waves, she's looking for something or someone that doesn't move. Not cold, not robotic, just steady. That's what masculinity really is. Not muscles, not money, emotional gravity. When she cries, you don't fix it, you hold space. When she tests you, you don't react, you stand firm. When she doubts you, you don't chase, you remain calm. Because calm energy in the face of chaos is the ultimate sign of strength, and strength is the foundation of attraction. Every woman on some level wants to feel safe enough to feel everything. If you can handle her fire without trying to control it, she'll feel something she doesn't feel often, trust. And once a woman trusts your energy, attraction becomes natural. You stop trying to make her want you. She just does. Because deep down, women aren't attracted to perfection. They're attracted to presence. They don't need a man who has all the answers. They want a man who doesn't lose himself when the questions come. That's the secret. Her emotions are the engine, but your calm, that's the key that starts it. Section 3. The mystery effect. I want to talk about mystery. Not the kind where you play games or act like you don't care. I mean the kind that lives inside energy. That quiet uncertainty that makes her wonder, who is this man really? That feeling? That's attraction being born. Here's something men never want to admit. Predictability kills desire. Complacency kills spark. When she knows exactly what you'll say, exactly how you'll act, and exactly how much you care, her emotions flatline. Not because she's ungrateful, not because she wants drama, because her psychology needs uncertainty to feel alive. Women are emotional explorers. They're drawn to men who make them feel something new. That doesn't mean being cold or distant. It means staying slightly unpredictable. Not in your morals or values, but in your energy. Let me explain. When she texts you, don't rush to respond every time. When she pulls away, don't chase immediately. When she tests you, don't fight back. Pause. That pause is power. That silence builds curiosity. You see, women don't fall for words. They fall for imagination. They fall for the version of you that exists in her mind when you're not around. That's why the most magnetic men aren't the ones who talk the most. They're the ones who leave space for mystery, space for wondering. You think being available all the time proves loyalty, but to her it feels like predictability. It feels like she's already figured you out, and once that happens, the spark fades. Attraction needs contrast, light and shadow, certainty and curiosity. When everything's obvious, emotion dies. Think about the movies or songs that stay with you. They don't give you everything up front. They make you wait. They make you feel. That's exactly how attraction works. She doesn't want a man who hides. She wants a man with depth. Someone who shows parts of himself slowly. Someone who makes her earn access to his inner world. Because what's earned is always valued more than what's given away too soon. And that's what men get wrong. They open their whole heart too fast. They tell their life story before she's emotionally invested. They hand her the entire map before she's even started the journey. Let her discover you, bit by bit, layer by layer, not because you're pretending, but because you respect the process of connection. Mystery is not manipulation, it's emotional pacing. It's the art of letting attraction breathe. When you hold your frame, when you stay calm under her curiosity, when you don't reveal everything at once, she starts to feel something rare, that she wants more. And that's the heartbeat of female attraction. It's not about what she knows about you, it's about what she wants to know. Be interesting, not by performing, but by being less available than her emotions expect. That gap creates energy. That energy creates desire. And desire is the soul of attraction. Section 4. The balance of power. Every relationship, whether it lasts a week or a lifetime, runs on invisible power. Not physical power, not financial power, emotional power. It's the unspoken current that decides who's leading the dance and who's reacting to the music. And here's the uncomfortable truth most men never want to hear. The moment you start reacting too much, you lose it. When she says something sharp and you instantly defend yourself, you lose it. When she pulls away and you panic, you lose it. When she tests your patience and you explode, you lose it. Because the power was never about control, it was about composure. See, women don't test men because they're cruel or manipulative. They test because they want to feel something. Strength, not dominance, not ego, stability. A woman's mind constantly asks one silent question. Can this man handle me? Handle my moods? Handle my emotions? Handle the storm? If you crumble, she knows she can't trust you. Not emotionally, not long term. Because if you can't stand firm with her, how will you stand firm for her? Every time you pass a test, not by fighting back, not by lecturing her, but by staying calm, you become magnetic. Because calm is rare, and rare is attractive. Most men confuse emotional strength with coldness, but strength doesn't mean being distant. It means being unshaken. You can love her deeply and still stay grounded. You can care about her feelings without being controlled by them. That's what she's really searching for, a man who can hold her chaos without becoming part of it. Here's something that will change the way you see female behavior forever. When a woman argues, she's not always looking for logic. She's often looking for leadership, not control, direction. She wants to feel your confidence, not your compliance. When she throws emotional fire, she's unconsciously asking, can you stay steady even when I'm not? And if you can, she relaxes. Because now she knows you're the anchor. That's the balance of power. It's not about who wins the argument. It's about who keeps their center when everything around them starts to shake. But men lose that power when they start living for her approval, when they start measuring their worth by her moods, when they forget that leadership in a relationship doesn't come from dominance, it comes from direction. Women respect men who know where they're going, men who don't need constant validation, men who can walk away if the respect disappears, not out of anger, but out of self-worth. Because here's a secret: the moment she realizes you won't chase her every time she withdraws, she starts chasing you emotionally. The energy flips. Not because you're playing games, but because you've shown her something powerful. You're not afraid to lose her, and that's exactly what makes her afraid to lose you. The balance of power isn't about control, it's about certainty. The man who controls nothing but himself always wins the dynamic. Be the storm's calm, not its casualty. That's the kind of man her emotions will always orbit around. Section 5. The female fleeter. Here's something you need to understand about women. They are always filtering, not in a manipulative way, not even consciously, most of the time. It's instinct. It's thousands of years of evolution, refined through emotion. Every man a woman meets goes through her internal filter. Can I trust him? Can I relax with him? Can he lead me emotionally? Those questions never stop running in the background, and she doesn't answer them with her mind. She answers them with her nervous system. If you come across desperate, she feels it instantly. If you act fake confident, she senses the tension behind your words. If your energy is off, no matter how much you smile, her instincts sound the alarm. That's because women are emotionally intuitive in a way men rarely are. They notice tone before language. They feel energy before meaning. They sense weakness before words. That's the female filter. Every time you interact with a woman, she's reading you on multiple layers you can't see. How do you hold eye contact? How do you carry silence? How do you respond when things don't go your way? These are micro-tests, small, subtle, emotional scans, and the result decides whether she feels attraction or indifference. Most men think attraction is built through effort. Buy gifts, send good morning texts, compliment her endlessly, but that's not what gets through the filter. Consistency, composure, direction, that's what passes the test. Because a woman's emotions can't relax around a man who's unsure of himself. She doesn't want to become your purpose. She wants to join a man who already has one. That's the difference between being seen as an option and being seen as a man of value. Here's what women never say out loud but always feel. If she has to lead emotionally, she loses attraction. If she has to explain how to handle her moods, she loses respect. If she senses that you need her approval to feel okay, she loses desire. She doesn't want a boy to mother, she wants a man to follow. That doesn't mean being controlling. It means being clear, grounded, able to stand on your own, even when her emotions swirl around you. Every woman's emotional filter is designed to detect authentic masculinity. And I don't mean alpha posturing or fake toughness. I mean emotional control, inner calm, unshakable self-respect. That's what passes through the filter every time. When you speak, your tone tells her if your words are real. When you look at her, your eyes tell her if you're confident or afraid. When you face conflict, your behavior tells her whether you're a leader or a follower. The truth is, she's not impressed by what you say. She's moved by what you radiate. You can't fake your way through the female filter. You can only align your inner world so that what she feels is congruent with what you are. When you reach that point, when your actions, words, and emotions all speak the same language, she doesn't need to think about trusting you. She just does. And once you pass that filter, attraction stops being something you chase. It becomes something she feels on her own. Section 6. The chaos and the calm. Every man dreams of a peaceful relationship. No arguments, no drama, no emotional storms. Sounds perfect, right? It's not. Because peace without passion turns into boredom, and boredom kills love faster than conflict ever will. Women aren't drawn to chaos, but they're drawn to aliveness, to the emotional current that makes them feel. When everything feels too calm, too safe, too predictable, something deep in her starts to fade. She starts to miss the spark, the intensity, the pulse of emotion that reminds her she's still alive. And that's where most men lose them. Not because they did something wrong, but because they did nothing at all. See, attraction is built on polarity, masculine and feminine, stillness and storm, logic and emotion. You can't have one without the other. If you're too logical, she feels unseen. If you're too emotional, she feels unsafe. The magic lives in the space between both, calm and chaos. That's why women sometimes start fights out of nowhere, not because they enjoy conflict, but because they crave connection. It's their subconscious way of shaking the emotional snow globe just to see if you're still inside it. And what do most men do? They panic, they defend, they take the bait. But the man who stays calm, who listens, who doesn't match her chaos, who doesn't lecture or retreat, that man becomes magnetic because she feels something powerful. I can lose control around him and still feel safe. That's the secret most men never learn. You don't need to eliminate her chaos, you need to anchor it. You can't stop the emotional waves. You just need to be the shore that doesn't move. That doesn't mean you allow disrespect or emotional abuse. Boundaries matter, but the way you enforce them matters even more. You don't yell, threaten, or plead. You just mean what you say, quietly, firmly, consistently. That energy, calm confidence is what keeps her drawn in, because she knows she can feel everything around you without breaking you, and that creates emotional freedom. Most women won't admit this, but the men they remember aren't the ones who were nice. They're the ones who made them feel deeply, the ones who brought warmth and challenge, peace and fire, the ones who could be soft when it mattered and unshakable when it counted. That's the balance every woman is subconsciously looking for. The man who gives her the calm she can rest in and the fire that keeps her awake, because love without energy feels like friendship and desire without peace feels like danger. But when both exist, when she can feel safe and stirred, that's when her entire psychology lights up. If you can master that balance, you'll never need to chase another woman. She'll feel you before she even understands why, because in her heart, she'll know you're the storm she can trust. Section 7. The female mind in modern times. We live in a different world now, a world that rewired the female brain in ways no generation before has experienced. Once upon a time, a woman's attention was earned in person, eye contact, voice tone, energy. Now it's earned through pixels, likes, comments, messages from strangers she'll never meet. Validation is instant, endless, and addictive. That constant attention doesn't just change her behavior, it changes her chemistry. Every notification releases a small hit of dopamine. Every compliment feeds her ego, and slowly, without realizing it, she starts to associate value with visibility. She doesn't mean to, but in a world that never stops watching, it's hard not to crave being seen. This is the new female psychology: overstimulated, overvalidated, and emotionally overwhelmed. When everything is available, nothing feels special anymore. That's why so many modern women say they can't find good men. It's not that good men don't exist, it's that they can't feel them through the noise. Social media created the illusion of infinite options. Hundreds of men at her fingertips, messages waiting in her inbox, compliments on every post. But here's the paradox. The more attention she gets, the less satisfaction she feels, because attention is not connection, flattery is not attraction, and options are not intimacy. Every "you're beautiful" comment dulls her ability to feel something real. Every new admirer becomes background noise. That's why the men who stand out today aren't the ones chasing, they're the ones unaffected. You don't compete by shouting louder, you stand out by being silent and solid, by being the one man who doesn't flinch when the world throws distractions her way. Because while everyone else is trying to impress her, you're showing her something rare: peace. In this new era, peace is power, calm is charisma, and presence is currency. You can't outshine 1,000 men online, but you can outground them. You can be the one who isn't trying to sell himself, the one who doesn't need her attention to feel valuable, the one who's too focused on his own life to beg for hers. That's what pulls her in now. Not the man who wants her most, the man who needs her least. Because deep down, every woman living in this overstimulated world is tired of pretending, tired of the chase, tired of empty validation. She's waiting for a man who feels real, a man who doesn't move at the speed of her notifications, a man whose silence has weight, whose attention feels earned, whose presence feels like calm in a storm. You can't compete with the world, but you can stand apart from it. When you do that, when your energy says, "I'm not here to win you, I'm here to see you," she feels something no follower, no comment, no DM can give her. She feels grounded, and in a world full of noise, the grounded man becomes unforgettable. Section 8. What women really want. Let's cut through every cliche, every dating myth, every line of advice you've ever heard. Because this is the truth. Women don't always want who makes the most sense. They want who makes them feel the most alive. Every woman has 3 versions of men in her life. The one she likes, the one she lusts for, and the one she loves. The one she likes makes her comfortable. He listens, he cares, he's safe, but he doesn't move her. He's the friend, the "you're such a nice guy" man. She respects him, but her body stays silent around him. The one she lusts for wakes something up in her she can't control. She feels it in her stomach, in her skin, in her pulse. He's chaos wrapped in confidence. He doesn't ask permission, he just exists with purpose. He triggers her wild side, the part of her that feels both danger and desire in the same breath. And then there's the one she loves. He's the bridge between the two. He gives her safety without smothering her. He gives her excitement without destroying her peace. He gives her leadership without control. That's the man every woman hopes to find, the one who brings her both fire and freedom, but most men never become that man. They either play it too safe or push too hard. They either act like her therapist or her thrill ride. They forget that women want both. You can't bore her into loving you, and you can't scare her into staying. You have to lead her into feeling. That's what she really wants to feel deeply. Not just love, but all of it. Desire, respect, tension, warmth, excitement, calm, even fear of losing you. Because the truth is, love without tension fades. She wants to be challenged, not controlled, led, not dominated, desired, not worshipped. She wants a man who looks at her like he knows her soul, but can walk away if she disrespects him. That duality, strength and softness, is what separates the man she keeps thinking about from the man she forgets. Women don't crave perfection, they crave polarity. They want to feel feminine around you, which only happens if you stand firmly in your masculine. That doesn't mean macho, it means you're emotionally stable, purposeful, and unshaken by her moods. It means you make her feel safe enough to surrender, not because she has to, but because she wants to. You see, the modern man keeps trying to earn love. The wise man embodies it. He doesn't convince, he doesn't chase, he creates an emotional world she wants to be part of. That's what women really want. Not your promises, your possessions, or your perfect words, but your presence. The kind of presence that says, I don't need to control you, I'm already complete. That's the energy that pulls her closer. That's the energy she can feel even when you say nothing. That's the man she trusts with her chaos, because he's not trying to fix it. She doesn't fall in love with how much you need her. She falls in love with how much you don't lose yourself when you're with her. That's what separates attraction from attachment. That's what keeps her craving you, not just your attention. Section 9. Understanding her heart. You can learn every tactic, every line, every theory about women, but if you don't understand her heart, you'll never truly understand her. A woman's heart isn't logical. It's not built like yours. It's layered, fluid, alive. It feels before it thinks. It decides before it explains. When she loves you, she doesn't love you a little. She gives everything. Her energy, her faith, her softness. And when she stops loving you, she doesn't stop halfway either. She closes the door and never looks back. That's the duality of her heart. Devotion and detachment, both absolute. You see, when a woman begins to fall, it's not because of what you said. It's because of how you made her feel. You gave her calm when the world felt loud. You made her feel seen without her needing to perform. You made her feel safe, not because you protected her from life, but because you were steady through it. But when that feeling disappears, when you stop leading, when you start begging, when your confidence turns into fear, something inside her begins to fade, and once it fades, it never comes back the same. Women remember feelings, not facts. They won't recall your words. They'll recall the emotional temperature of being with you. Did she feel alive? Did she feel adored? Did she feel safe? Or did she feel unseen, unheard, unloved? That's the story her heart will retell forever, and it decides whether she stays or goes. Here's what most men never realize. A woman doesn't leave when she stops loving you. She leaves when she stops believing in you. When she no longer feels the strength, the leadership, the calm that made her trust you in the first place. Once that belief breaks, nothing you say can rebuild it. You can buy her flowers, send messages, make promises, but her heart only listens to one thing: your energy. If your energy is needy, she feels pity. If your energy is angry, she feels fear. But if your energy is grounded, calm, detached, self-assured, she feels something she can't explain. Respect, maybe even regret. That's why men who chase lose, and men who walk away win. Not because women want to suffer, but because emotional contrast reignites what comfort destroyed. You see, when you stop trying to convince her, you remind her of who you were when she first fell for you. A man who didn't need her but chose her. That's the truth about female loyalty. When she's in love, she'll walk through fire for you. She'll defend you, forgive you, stand by you. But once her trust in your strength breaks, her love collapses under its own weight. You can't rebuild it with words. You can only rebuild it with gravity. Be the man who stays steady in storms. The man who doesn't need control to feel powerful. The man whose silence carries more weight than 1,000 apologies. Because that's the kind of man a woman never forgets. He might not be the loudest. He might not be the richest. But his presence, it lingers. It lingers in the quiet moments after she leaves. It echoes in the men she meets after him. It whispers through every something's missing she can't explain. Understanding her heart isn't about mastering her, it's about mastering yourself. Because when you stand firm in who you are, when you lead with strength, move with calm, love with purpose, and let go with dignity, You become what every woman is subconsciously searching for, not perfection, not performance, but peace. And once you embody that, she doesn't just want you, she trusts you, she follows you, she feels you. That's the final truth about female psychology. She'll never love you for what you say, she'll love you for what she feels when she's near you. And that feeling, that calm, that depth, that power, is what separates a man she once dated from the man she'll never forget.